Hi, this is Ruth McCambridge, the editor-in-chief of Nonprofit Quarterly, and I am so glad to welcome you all to our webcast this afternoon. We're thrilled to bring you in person a review of the 2016 findings of the annual Giving USA report, which looks at the giving patterns that have occurred over the previous year, in this case 2015. We are very happy to bring this to you free of charge, and that is because Microsoft Microsoft Philanthropies is sponsoring this. Microsoft Philanthropies gives away more than $2 million in product donations to nonprofits around the world. Your nonprofit may be eligible to receive the latest Microsoft technology like Office 365, Dynamics CRM, Enterprise, Mobility, and Power B1 for free or at a significant discount. So get started today by visiting www.microsoft.com. And now I'd like to just introduce to you our speakers for the day. Our main speaker is Patrick Rooney, who's the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Research at Indiana University, Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Ruth.
And after he speaks, we will also hear from Nathan Dietz, who's a Senior Research Associate at Urban Institute. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you, Ruth.
And finally, Keith Curtis from the Giving USA Foundation. He's the chairman. And welcome, Keith.
Thanks, Ruth.
We have a sellout crowd today in terms of people listening, but we do want to encourage people, as they're hearing things that they have questions about, to just log in your questions by there's a Q&A box on the left-hand side of your screen. Click that and log in the question, and we will pick the questions that seem to have the most interest during the course of the presentations, and we'll ask those questions as we conclude the presentations. We hope to have a significant amount of time for those questions. Finally, I do want to remind people that it's great that you're here, but we want to also share this information with other people. So you can do that by tweeting with us at #NPQ on Giving USA. With that, I want to just turn it over quickly to Patrick, who has a lot to say about what's happened in charitable giving over the past year. And so, Patrick, I'm going to hand this over to you now.
Hey, thank you, Ruth. Hi, this is Patrick Rooney, and I just want to welcome you. This is very exciting to be presenting the Giving USA 2016 Annual Report on Philanthropy for the year 2015. This has been produced and written and published by Giving USA for over 60 years, and the Giving USA Foundation and the Giving Institute are the proud sponsors. Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy has been the research partner for the last 15 years or so. And I think it's important to point out that this is the longest running annual report on the U.S. charitable landscape, and it's the only one that has simultaneously estimates all of the sources of giving and all of the uses of giving every year going back over 60 years. So this is also made possible from philanthropy of firms and others. Thanks for. I hope you've all pie chart. This is the simultaneous all the uses. I'm sorry, and it has the grand total of $373.25 billion. This is the largest amount of philanthropy that's ever been recorded in the United States, and it's a record amount last year and a record amount the year before, and we're excited to see this large amount. I think one way of framing this is to think about that's over $1 billion a day. So this is a very non-trivial amount, as economists would say. It's a very large amount. Where does the money come from? Well, 71% comes from living individuals, their household checkbooks. Another 9% comes from individuals who have recently passed through their charitable bequests, and 16% comes from foundations. This includes family foundations, independent foundations, operating foundations, and community foundations. One of the things that we know is that over half of the foundation grant funds comes from family foundations. And so when you add up the inter vivos giving, the bequest giving, and the amount of money coming from family foundations, that 87% or more is coming from individuals and their household checkbook, their family philanthropy foundation checkbook, or through their charitable bequests. Finally, corporations contribute 5% of total giving. Now, this is that 5% has been very steady at about 5% for many years. Some people argue, and I do want to point out, that this number understates the true impact of corporate giving because it does not include corporate sponsorships and other commercial activities that comes out of their marketing budgets. But I think for Giving USA, it's important to acknowledge we are measuring philanthropy, and so if the corporations don't say that's philanthropic, we're not going to say that's philanthropic. Turning to the uses side, where does the money go? 32%, the largest share, goes to religion. It's still the largest share, but it's important to note that 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, when we were first doing Giving USA, that percentage was over half. And so that there has been a, pardon the pun, a secular trend down in the share of giving going to religion. And we can talk more about that later. It's not the case that giving to religion has gone down in absolute terms most years, but rather it has grown at a slower rate than giving to some of the other subsectors. Education comes in second at 15%. Education does very well, especially higher ed, when the stock market's doing well. And we've seen a nice run up in the stock market in the last few years. Human services at 12%. Gifts to foundation at 11%. One of the things that's important, we acknowledge that most charities would rather have those gifts going to foundations coming into their own nonprofits' coffers. At the same time, these gifts to foundations represent a permanent commitment to philanthropy, and so that those gifts will be coming out as grants in the future. Healthcare got 8% of total giving last year. Public society benefit got 7%. Public society benefit is a little bit of a confusing amalgamation of subsectors. It includes not only things like United Ways, Jewish federations, Catholic charities. It also includes so large federated funds that are fundraising and then regranting, but it also includes the for-profit donor advised funds that are run by the Fidelities and the Schwabs and so on. Arts and culture got 5%, international 4%, environment and animals 3%. I think it's worth acknowledging that environment and animals and international we've only been tracking since 1987, but they have been two of the fastest growing subsectors since we started tracking them. Recently we've started tracking gifts to individuals at 2%. These are largely gifts from pharmaceutical companies going to individuals that are subsidized or free legal drugs that the pharmaceutical companies are providing to individuals to improve their health care. The unallocated at 1% is really a difference between timing of gifts, the receipt of gifts by an individual, by individual charities, and individuals making the gifts. It could also be due to things like a charitable remainder trust or delay when somebody makes a donor advice fund contribution and then that gets paid out later. So some of these things don't exactly match up when we look at the sources and uses, but that share of the pie is very small at 1%. All right, let's look at the rates of change of giving, both overall and by the different sources and uses. And this histogram shows them for the last 2 years, and then the cumulative effect. The right-hand column shows the cumulative effect for the last 2 years. Total giving increase, and I should note that these are in inflation-adjusted dollars. So everything is adjusted for inflation. As an economist, I can't help myself but to use inflation-adjusted dollars. But I think it is also more helpful when you're comparing trends over time to use inflation-adjusted dollars. So total giving increased last year 4% and the year before 6.1%. This is the first time since the mid-2000s that giving has increased over 10% in a two-year time period. So we're very excited to see this combined effect of over 10% demonstrating a very sustained recovery. And so I think we're pretty convinced that the Great Recession is well behind us, and we're really focused on the growth in philanthropy at this point. Giving by individuals has lagged total giving last year and the last 2 years, and it's growing steadily. It's worth noting that giving by individuals has grown fairly decently coming out of the Great Recession, but has still not surpassed where we were before the Great Recession. You know, that can be evaluated two ways. One is that there's some headroom, there's some growth, there's some growth room for gifts by individuals, but it's also the fact that some individuals have faced some economic uncertainty, and others have gotten jobs, but maybe not as high-paying jobs as they had before, and some of them are not giving as generously as they had before that. Gifts by foundations, so foundation grant making, grew 6.3% last year and 8.3% the year before. Very robust giving. This is largely driven by the fact that although the stock market last year was flat, went down 0.7%, for the 2 years before that, it grew very dramatically. And so we've seen a 15% increase the last 2 years in foundation grant making. When we look at charitable bequests, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, but charitable bequest giving went up 1.9% last year and almost 26% the year before. Bequest giving is always the most volatile piece of the pie on the sources side, and this is greatly influenced by the top few wealthiest estates and how philanthropic they are on a year-to-year basis. Corporate giving went up 3.8% last year and 10% the year before, for a combined 14.3%. I think we've seen a very robust recovery in many respects. Corporate profitability is the single best predictor of changes in corporate giving, and they've continued to increase. Corporate profits have continued to increase, but the corporate giving is growing even faster. All right, let's look at the rates of change by the sources. And I think it's important to point out, again, that giving to religion has grown, but it's grown more slowly than giving overall, and in fact more slowly than most of the other subsectors, at 2.6% last year, 6.2% for the last 2 years combined. Compare that to education, which grew 8.8% adjusted for inflation last year and over 14% the last 2 years. So you can see a very poignant contrast in those two. Human services have seen a nice recovery since the Great Recession, but the last 2 years, as the recovery has accelerated, the last 2 years we've seen sustained growth, but not as rapid as some of the other subsectors in human services at 7.8% for the last 2 years combined. The next point is giving to foundations. So this is individuals and estates giving to foundations. This is the only subsector that went down last year. It went down 4% in inflation-adjusted dollars after growing 5.3% the year before. One of the things we know is that, like bequests, this is one of the more volatile pieces of the pie. This typically follows either someone's passing or liquidity event, and then there's also a timing, because sometimes there's a lag between that liquidity event and the commitment to philanthropy, or someone's death and the finalization of their estate. So we're not too concerned about this volatility, but it is much more volatile than the other sources. Giving to healthcare went up 1.2% last year adjusted for inflation and 5% the year before. One of the things, and I want to be careful to say, I don't mean this as a political statement, I don't mean this as a demagogue at all, but just to say that given the fact that the Affordable Care Act has made healthcare more affordable for more people, it does not surprise me that we see a somewhat of a slowdown in the rate of growth of giving to healthcare. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out in the future and what impact the election has on that and any changes in public policy. We know historically that when the government increases their spending on one subsector, that the philanthropic subsector corresponding to that tends to grow at a slower rate in the future. Public society benefit, remember this is United Way's, Jewish Federation giving, but also the for-profit donor advised funds has grown over 5% each of the last 2 years, 11% the last 2 years combined. Arts, culture, and humanities, very robust, almost 18% the last 2 years combined. They were hammered during the Great Recession, and they're having a very robust growth right now. Looking at international affairs, 2 years ago, that absolutely declined in absolute dollars or inflation-adjusted dollars, 4.4%, and last year had a nice recovery of 17.4%. This was affected a little bit by the earthquake in Nepal, but that only changed that rate of growth by about 1 percentage point. So there's other factors driving that as well. Environment, animals, again, was hurt during the Great Recession, but it's had a very robust recovery, over 14% for the last 2 years combined. This histogram shows total giving in inflation-adjusted dollars are the bars, and the steel blue gray bars are non-recessionary years, and the yellow or mustard color bars are recessionary years, and the points on the line chart are the non-inflation or current dollars, not adjusting for inflation. So one of the things we can tell from looking at this histogram is that on average giving has grown in non-recessionary years in inflation-adjusted dollars, and during Great Recessions and other recessions, the giving has fallen in inflation-adjusted dollars. During the Great Recession, giving fell over 15%, and we've seen originally a slow but steady recovery from that, and in the last 2 years we've seen a more robust recovery, and we have surpassed the totals that predated the Great Recession, as we said earlier. Going to go fairly quickly through the history of each of these, the sources and then uses, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these slides, but we can address them in more detail during the question and answers if you'd like. One of the things that stands out during this in this graph is that during the period before 1995, giving by individuals grew at just over 1%. It was about 1% per year, compounded annually. Then we had the high-tech explosion from 1995 to 2000, and gifts by individuals and households accelerated in a wild rate of growth. One of the things that happened following the attack on America was we had a relatively minor and short-lived recession, but it was a recession, and giving by individuals went down, but it did not go down back to where it was before the high-tech boom. And so I think there was a change in the thermostat, so to speak, that permanently adjusted upward the amount of giving by households and individuals. Then we see some robust recovery, and then during the Great Recession, giving by individuals and households actually declined higher or more rapidly than did total giving by foundations is much smoother than the giving by other sources, but this largely reflects the fact that foundations pay out 5% of their asset base. Some foundations use a 2-year moving average, some use a 3-year moving average, others use a longer, and that inherently has a smoothing effect. This also reflects the growth in the number of foundations and the increase in the asset value or the portfolio effect of some of the existing foundations. Forecasting bequest giving is my nightmare. You can see the volatility here. This is very difficult. If you look at a trend line, it's a nice upward slope. On a year-to-year basis, there's a lot of volatility here. This is largely driven by the fact that whether bequest giving goes up or goes down is almost always affected by the 5 wealthiest estates in any one year. And in fact, some years, one estate makes a difference as to whether or not total charitable bequest giving goes up or goes down. Giving by corporations is, we see some business cycle effects here. This is largely driven by changes in corporate giving, but there are some other factors that play in as well. Most modern corporations have a philanthropy budget today, and they're usually giving out of last year's pre-tax corporate profits, and then they may make some additional gifts if there's a big disaster. But in general, they have budgeted an amount. And we can talk more about whether that's good or bad later. I think this is one of the more fascinating screens when you look at total giving as a percentage of total GDP. You look at this in two time periods as well. Pre-1995, it bumped around 1.6, 1.7% very consistently. Following the tech explosion in the late 1990s and the fairly robust economic recovery period then, total giving as a percentage of GDP grew to 2.2%. And then during the Great Depression, and it stayed around that. And during the Great Depression, it fell to 1.9%. It's come back, and it's been around 2.1% ever since then. I think there's only a couple of years when it hit 2.2%, and a few years when it hit 2.1%. But regardless, I think one of the challenges for the nonprofit sector is what would it take to move us from 2% to 4 or 5 or 10%. And I think this is an issue that we all have to take seriously. You know, one of the things that I did as a kind of a back of the envelope calculation is that if you reallocated $5 a day of superfluous spending, and I recognize not everybody has $5 a day, but on average, if people reallocated $5 a day of spending toward philanthropy, that would double household giving overnight. So this is something that's very doable. It just hasn't been done. Because I'm an economist and I like to look at empirical relationships, we always report or demonstrate this relationship between the S&P 500 and total giving. And you can see that in general, the total giving moves in the same direction as the S&P 500 without quite the same amplitude. If you think about this as a sine wave or a cosine wave, it has a similar pattern, but it doesn't have the same amplitude. Individual giving as a percentage of disposable personal income has bumped around. It's mostly been about 2%. And again, we talked about earlier about total giving as a percentage of GDP. See a very similar pattern here. We have to reflect the fact that about a third of households in any given year give exactly zero, and so that tends to lower the average. Of households who give anything, that tends to range between 3 and 4% on a year-to-year basis. Corporate giving as a percentage of pre-tax corporate profits, over the last 40 years, that's averaged about 0.8%. Some years it has done better. It's been as high as 1.4%, and before the attack on America, and earlier it had reached as high as 1.8%. But for most years, it's been under 1%, and we can talk about whether or not corporations would, in their own self-interest, want to give more to attract more loyalty from consumers, from employees, and from shareholders, or are they forced to give a relatively low amount because of pressure from shareholders to control costs? All right, let's look at the where the money is going, the uses side. Giving to religion is the kind of the tortoise and the hare. It tends to grow every year, but tends to grow more slowly than the other subsectors. During some of the recessions, it actually has gone down in inflation-adjusted dollars, but most years it continues to grow year in and year out. Giving to education has grown very rapidly over the last 40 years, and you can see some business cycle effects that following the attack on America and following the Great Recession, giving to education dropped. This is largely reflective of changes in the stock market, and I think it shows up fairly dramatically here. Giving to human services, again, we can see a very kind of steady growth going back to 1985, and it has been adversely affected by recessions, but less so than by some of the other subsectors. I think during the Great Recession, some individual donors and some foundations said, you know, it's more important to feed the hungry and house the homeless, and so they reallocated some of their philanthropic giving. I think post-Great Recession, as we've moved out of that, there's been a little bit of a move back to the status quo ante, and so human services has continued to grow, but at a little bit slower rate than some of the other subsectors. Giving to foundations, this looks a little bit like the charitable bequest giving, and again, this typically follows a liquidity event or a bequest. Someone leaves or populates an existing foundation or a new foundation when they die. So this is largely driven by significant changes in wealth and the transference of that wealth. The good news is these are all permanent commitments to philanthropy that are available to nonprofits over many years. Giving to health has seen some volatility historically, and it'll be interesting to see again the impact of the Affordable Care Act that has on giving to health. It's important to note that while the Affordable Care Act makes healthcare more affordable for many individuals, it does not obviate the need for research in cancer, leukemia, many other diseases, and so certainly we would hope that that would continue to grow in the future. Public society benefit, again, this is United Ways, Jewish Federations, Catholic Charities, but also the for-profit donor advised funds, and we've seen very robust growth in that since the Great Recession. Arts and culture, you can see, again, they were hammered by the Great Recession, and we see a very handsome upturn since then. Giving to international, if we go back to when we started tracking this in 1987, if we just took a straight line growth rate, that would be a very fast rate of growth, but we saw this huge spike before the Great Recession and then a very rapid decline, and now we're starting to see a return to where they were before the Great Recession, but it still has some dollars to catch up on in that regard. Environment and animals has been more of a secular upward path. They also have some business cycle effects, but that has been a story of almost continuous growth since we started tracking that in 1987. Since this is a study of philanthropy and volunteerism is a part of philanthropy, we wanted to report on the fact that there are almost 63 million volunteers in the United States last year, or in 2014, which represents about 25% of the adult population. The number of 501c3s has grew fairly dramatically from 2005 to 2010. You may recall that the IRS cleaned up its database and pulled off the list a number of charities that had not filed 990s and had not responded to inquiries from the IRS about whether or not they still existed. There were some stories about charities complaining about the fact that they still existed and the IRS had missed them because of moves and so on and so forth. But I don't know about you, but if the IRS sends me a letter, I tend to open that. So I put that on the nonprofits. In 2015, we have seen some growth in the number of nonprofits, and I think one of the things that we've seen historically is that the number of charities has grown just as the number of dollars has grown, and that Americans seem to be very comfortable with the notion of specialization and division of their philanthropic dollars and of the number of nonprofits servicing them in that light. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan.
Thank you, Patrick. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Actually, Patrick's last slide is a great place for me to start the discussion here, because I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what has happened, especially over the past year, within the nonprofit sector as a whole in terms of overall financial health. Contributions from individuals to nonprofit organizations that file Forms 990 to the IRS or 990-EZ only amount to about 13% of all the gross receipts that nonprofit organizations take in. So the results that I'm going to show are broader, I think, in scope than the ones that Patrick has shown you. But I think this first slide especially illustrates a couple of points that I think Patrick was trying to make. One is the very last one that he made, which is that even though on a net basis over the past few years the nonprofit sector has been growing in terms of the number of organizations, that masks the fact that every year there are new organizations forming and receiving their letters from the IRS that allow them to get tax-exempt status. And there are some organizations that go out of business just for all kinds of reasons. Even among the organizations that stay in business, year to year there are changes in their finances. Sometimes it's just due to good or bad luck, but in other cases these are signals of how well the organization is able to cope with their own financial situations. This first slide shows you that over half of organizations between 2013 and 2014 experienced either an increase or a decrease in their gross receipts from the previous year of more than 10%. And you may not see that if you just look at grand totals, but within the sector, there are always, every year, a large number of organizations that experience big changes in their finances. But I'm going to try to move along to leave enough room for questions and answers about all the results. So Patrick, if you could move on to the next slide. This next slide breaks up the results from the previous slide to show you what the winners and losers were, how prevalent winners and losers were within the individual subsectors of the nonprofit sector. The orange parts of the bars on the graph here represent the percentage of organizations that gained financially in gross receipts between 2013 and 2014. The blue rectangles on the bars represent the percentages of organizations that lost either a lot or a little from 2013 to 2014. What's striking about this, and you can probably see this most easily by looking at the dark blue rectangles at the bottom of the graph, but in higher education and in hospitals, which are the two which tend to have the very largest organizations in the nonprofit sector, those were the types of organizations that were least likely to experience big losses between 2013 and 2014. If you look at the top, at the dark orange rectangles, you can see that these were also the organizations that were least likely to experience big, large amounts of growth, 10% from year to year. It's the smaller organizations, especially in the arts, environment and animals, international organizations near to the far right of the graph, that are most likely to experience big changes, good or bad changes from year to year in gross receipts. So the last slide, I think, puts all this in historical perspective. And this last slide illustrates something else that Patrick has said, which is that in terms of getting to where we were pre-recession, we've done pretty well in terms of on a national basis, taking in a decent amount of money from individual contributions and from other sources, but we still have some headroom, I think, to before we're at the point where those totals are the equal of what we saw before the recession. And this last slide, I think, does a good job of illustrating that the same is true for intake of receipts across the entire nonprofit sector. I think the easiest way to see that is to take a look at this light blue line with the numbers attached to it that sort of runs through the bottom of the chart. Those represent the median percentages of growth year to year across the entire sector, all subsectors. Before the recession, 2005, 2006, 2007, the median nonprofit gained about 5%, give or take, in terms of gross receipts from year to year. In 2009, when the recession was at its worst and was having its biggest impact on nonprofits, the median nonprofit organization actually lost in terms of what they took in from 2008. But as you can see from that point on, that median growth rate, the growth rate for median nonprofit organizations has continually increased. And this year, or in 2014 actually, the median nonprofit grew by 2.7%, in terms of revenues coming in from all sources, which is the highest that we've seen since 2007, actually. It's right before the Great Recession hit. So I think the lesson overall is that we're recovering from the recession. Nonprofit organizations are recovering from the recession. Individual contributions and contributions from other private sources and corporate sources have something to do with that, but because those are such a small proportion of all the money that nonprofits take in, you can see that that nonprofits are able to recover based on the support that they're getting from these other sources as well. I would love to present a version of this chart here on this last slide that shows a longer time series so that we can compare it directly to the time series that Patrick is looking at. But I hope you can see from this that the story of what's been happening for individual contributions to all organizations is pretty much mirrored. Not exactly, but as its counterpart to what you see in the nonprofit sector overall. And I think I'll stop there. That leaves us a few minutes at least for Q&A.
Ruth, are you ready for me to just follow up on a couple of things? I want to thank Patrick and Nathan. Great information, I think, for all of us to have. And on behalf of the Giving USA Foundation, I want you to know how much we appreciate Nonprofit Quarterly, really giving us this opportunity to share within with the nonprofit sector. It's wonderful research for us to have, and it's also an opportunity to use this information to educate our boards, our volunteers, our donors, and even staff members about what's happening. So as we have nonprofit professionals here, try and use this information. One of the things that we're doing is we are offering up a discount for folks if they'd like to purchase this research. We'll have that slide up again probably at the end, but we'll have a 10% discount if you would like to get some of that information. What I'd like to do is take a minute or two really to reflect back on some of the key findings that Patrick and both Nathan talked about, and really some of the things that we're seeing within the Giving Institute, Giving USA Foundation, that some nonprofits really ought to be doing in light of this research. So, every year when this research comes out, and Patrick alluded to this a little bit, there's always somebody out there that's saying, really Americans ought to give more. The reality is that would be something that we may want to have a discussion about. It would be interesting to really get feedback from folks. But I also think we've got to take a moment to really celebrate, as Patrick mentioned earlier on, celebrate this $1 billion a day that on average donors are giving. That is something that's pretty amazing. It's heartening that people want to make a difference. They want to make a difference in supporting the causes that matter to them, whether it's locally, nationally, or as we've seen, internationally. And right now we know that Americans are embracing philanthropy at a higher level than they ever have before. Yes, it's still around 2% of GDP, but we have to remember we've got 2 straight years of highs, record highs in there. So a couple of things that really stand out to me in the report that Patrick had talked about is just this piece again, and to remind everyone that really 9 out of every $10 almost is really coming directly from individuals who are supporting charitable causes. I think it's also interesting to see the changes over the years in philanthropy, the growth, for instance, of online giving that we've seen. You go back 20 years or so, we wouldn't have had that. The crowdfunding pieces, the days of giving that we've seen. The other donor vehicles. Patrick talked about the private family foundations and how big of a piece that they represent in that foundation sector, but also in recent years this growth of these donor advised funds, especially from the national organizations. And then there's the mega gifts that we have, and the fact that 50% of all of our giving in this country is coming from about 5.6% of the population. So, I think all of these are important things for us to note. And also this piece is, as we've come out of the Great Recession, are donors really reverting back to that norm of pre-recession? We've seen that growth in arts and education and environment, as we've talked about. So keeping all of those things in mind, just a couple of things we should focus on as nonprofit professionals. One is it's donor retention. We hear a lot about dollars up, donors down. We know that there's been a slight decrease in the number of donors, even though there's been this increase in overall giving. Sort of the investment philanthropy thought of people really looking for impact, especially these big donors, really thinking of their giving as investment. Donor advised funds, with the growth there, what are we doing as nonprofit professionals to really tap into those dollars? There's billions of dollars in those funds, and we have to make sure that we know how to reach out to them, focusing on planned giving as the baby boomers are aging, and what are we going to do about this? So I think what it all means is that as nonprofit professionals and board members, we've got to keep in mind that it's important for us to be talking to our donors to let them know what their gift accomplished. It's important for us to be talking to those mid-level donors to see how we can move them up through the pipeline. And I think it's important for us to think a little bit with all of our loyal donors and volunteers, talking to them about the opportunity to leave a legacy through planned giving. So there's a lot of things we have to do as we're talking to donors. I think the key thing is that even if we're in a small shop or we think we don't have the time to do it, we need to do it because even a few of these conversations can really help us move the needle. So I'll wrap up there, and I'll turn it over to Ruth, and I look forward to the questions that you all are going to have. So Ruth, back to you.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for everybody who came, for being patient with. This is our first time using Google Hangout as a base for a webinar, and the reason why we did that was because there were so many of you that wanted to sign up, and so just in trying to get all of you in, if there's any roughness here, in other words, we apologize for it, and we thank you for hanging in there with us. I do want to, I'm going to basically take the questions that people have provided for us and ask one person at first to respond to it, but I really want for all of the panelists to feel perfectly free to respond. There were some very interesting questions, but I want to preface any questions we have. One question that I thought was particularly interesting is a question about whether or not nonprofits who charge fees do better than nonprofits who don't. And this is clearly a question for Nathan. But I do want to say that we did do a map of the nonprofit economy a number of years ago, and we looked at how much, what were the biggest sources of funds for nonprofits. And by far the biggest source of fund for nonprofits is fees and contracts. And so those, we have to keep that in mind, that when we're talking about giving, it's one part of the nonprofit economy, and there are some others. For some organizations, giving is a very small part of their own organizational economy. For others, it's everything. So we take that into account whenever we talk about this. But Nathan, I'm going to kick this question to you about, is there a difference in the health of nonprofits who do charge fees? Have you noticed that at all in any of the research you've done?
That's, hopefully I'm unmuted, right?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, that's hard to answer. The reason why I think that's hard to answer, Ruth, is that for most organizations take in at least some of their revenues from fees for service or from the sale of goods and services. The grand total of a total of over 60%. Actually, that's almost 70%. Looking at my numbers here, of all revenues across nonprofit organizations come from one of those two sources. So, yeah, and you see very different results, I think, if you think about hospitals or higher education institutions, which are heavily reliant on fees, versus human service organizations, which are heavily reliant on grants from government and other sources like that. They experience very different outcomes, and they and they always have. I think that that's been a recent part of the recent trend, and it's probably going to be occurring in the future. So I think it really depends on what type of organization you're talking about, and before I think you need to know that to give a complete answer to that question.
Right. So the devil's in the details, but contextually, it is a very interesting question. We have to look at the whole of our economies, all of the revenue sources, to understand how we're likely to be affected by one trend or another. So this next one, I think, is for you, Patrick, which is, can you talk about to what extent the giving recorded in Giving USA is cash versus volunteer hours and in kind? And I know this is one of your favorite nerdy interests, so go ahead.
Thanks, Ruth. So, better. I just want to follow up on one thing on the prior question too, before I move on to it. And one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge is that, you know, colleges and universities and hospitals are among the largest, you know, the meds and eds, they're among the largest nonprofit organizations in the United States, and they also have the most fee income, right? Tuition and medical services and so on. But they also tend to raise the most money. And so I think on the, you know, so on the one hand, these types of sources of income could be substitute goods, that is, you know, they have one or the other, and for some charities they're all contracts and grants, or they're all fee income, and others are all philanthropic. But for many charities it's both, and that the philanthropic piece is that margin of excellence. So, you know, one of the reasons that Harvard is a great university is because it raises a lot of money. One of the reasons that, you know, some of the best known hospitals are great hospitals is because they raise a lot of money. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the both aspect that affects many charities. It's not just one or the other. On the nerdiness of in-kind versus cash giving, I think it's you know, kind of a rule of thumb that has held up for a number of years for corporate giving, is that about 20% of corporate giving is in-kind giving. It's you know, largely driven by pharma and technology firms that are giving product either free or at vastly reduced prices, and that type of philanthropy captures some headlines and is important, but it's not the vast majority of giving. And then in terms of households, you know, obviously people give clothes and furniture and stuff to Goodwill and organizations like that, but that's a kind of de minimis amount of total household giving, and so the vast majority of giving overall is actually cash.
And this study really does not include any value for volunteer hours.
Right. We report it, but that's not. It doesn't affect the $373 billion amount. So we just report it because that's part of philanthropy. But the volunteerism is just another component of philanthropy, but not part of the Giving USA numbers.
Okay. So one of our participants is interested in why the growth in public sector benefit giving. What, you know, what's your impression about how that happened? What's pushing that? And this is for either Keith or Patrick.
Patrick, go ahead, jump in, and I'll add to it.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I think that, so there's two pieces, and it would be fabulous if we could unpack this in the research, but right now we can't do that yet. But, you know, there's the one piece that's the federated giving, so the federal government campaign, United Ways, Jewish Federation, and so on. And what we see for most of those campaigns over a long period of time is that those are flat or declining in inflation-adjusted dollars. In fact, over the last 25 years, Jewish Federation giving has gone down by over a third. I think it's 37%. So we see a remarkable trend in that one direction. United Ways, again, largely flat, facing in inflation-adjusted dollars. On the other hand, you have the donor advised funds that are growing so rapidly at the for-profit entities, and so that's really the driver of the growth piece of that segment.
And I think, Patrick, if I think I've got these numbers right, this is like we're now the growth in these big national donor advised funds. For the first time, they've got more assets really than what the donor advised funds would at community foundations. And so we have seen this huge growth, and I think that that a lot of nonprofit organizations need to be keeping in mind that these organizations are there. I mean, especially the big three of the Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard, that, you know, those donors are giving, and they've got a very strategic sense about their giving. So when you are getting those checks in, you know, if that check's coming in from Fidelity, you've got to make sure that you're not just thinking this is, and it's amazing to us the number of nonprofits that do this. They think the gift is coming from Fidelity, and what they have to make sure they're doing is thanking that donor, that fund holder who has it, because there's a good chance they'll keep giving to you.
Yeah, Ruth, if I can just add on to that. So, and Keith, I think that's a really important point, because a lot of those gifts are, you know, the donor is willing to be known. One of the reasons that I think donor advised funds, though, are growing is that it allows the donor to be as anonymous as they want to be. So they may have given directions to the distributor not to let the recipient charity know from whom the gift actually came, and so then it's, you know, it's frustrating for the charities because they can't steward or solicit the gift as they might want to otherwise. But to the extent, every extent possible, charities need to acknowledge the original donor and then cultivate them for future giving, because I think Keith's absolutely right that there will be more opportunities in the future.
Okay, there's a little follow-up question, and you know I ask you this every year, which is, how do you account for duplicate gifts? And by that I mean, if somebody gives to a donor advised fund in the same year that the donor advised fund gives to a nonprofit, how is that managed in the context of the research?
Yeah, thanks. So one of the things that we do, and I'll just say, this is not absolutely perfect, but one of the things that we do is, to avoid the double counting, is we report the net inflows and outflows. And so let's say that there's, just to use an even number, let's say that there's $10 million donated to donor advised funds this year, and that there was 12 million paid out. We're going to count the paid out part, that difference between what was paid out and what was contributed, so that we don't have the double counting. We know that on average for the last several years, the big national for-profit donor advised funds have they've been paying out just over 20% of what they take in each year. So you know, there is some, you know, a little bit of a lag, but if you compare that to private foundations, which pay out an average of 5%, that's a much more rapid payout rate.
Right. Okay, did anyone else want to say anything about that, or? Okay. One question is, what is going on with corporate giving? Why, considering where profits are at this point, Why is that at such a low proportionate level?
So Ruth, maybe I'll start and then anybody else can jump in. So I think part of this is mathematical, and part of it is a value choice, right? And so the mathematical piece is, I think one of the reasons it's lower than the historical norm is that profits have continued to grow. Corporations are budgeting this year's giving based on the prior year's profitability. And so if the profits continue to grow, then this year's giving as a share of this year's profits will be lower than what was budgeted or expected. So if you're planning on 1%, for example, and profits continue to grow and you give out of this year's income, but you were budgeting against last year's profit, that's going to be a little bit lower. So that's the mathematical piece. The value piece is, I think this is an interesting question that shareholders, employees, and customers need to raise with corporations. If, Milton Friedman used to say, the business of business is business, and the corporation shouldn't give out anything. They should pay out dividends and profits and to shareholders and pay wages and let the employees and the consumers and the shareholders make different decisions about their philanthropy. I think most people see corporations in the modern era as being a part of a community and part of our society, and that they have a duty to give back to their communities however they define them. And in fact, I think millennials who are oftentimes making career choices and job decisions based on the corporate social responsibility of their employers, I think they're going to push their employers to give more than they have historically.
Mm-hmm. And Nathan, you may want to add to this too, but this is a little more anecdotal, that something that we're seeing a lot is that, and Patrick alluded to this in his presentation, we don't count marketing dollars essentially. We're finding that there's a lot of corporations now that they're looking at what they consider their giving to really be tied into their mission and vision, and they're doing a lot of things where they're doing it either through cause marketing, volunteer engagement, and so we're not necessarily counting it as a charitable gift, but they are out there doing things where their employees are participating in it, and they may be giving more marketing dollars, so they're getting some of that exposure. So I'm not saying that we still aren't hoping for the charitable side, but I find that we're seeing a little bit more of that today.
Well, just to add to that, Keith and Patrick, when I see this chart, I wonder whether or not the growth in popularity and the growth in prevalence of social enterprises of various kinds might have something to do with this. I think social enterprise is a term that is kind of hard to define because people use it in all kinds of ways. But I think one common characteristic that social enterprises have is that they don't try to maximize their profits. They try to pour as much of their resources into mission-oriented activities, or they try to pour a large amount of their resources into mission-oriented activities as possible. But they oftentimes pass up the chance to really pursue activities that will bring in a lot of cash because they're mission-oriented. So a measure like this, if the more social enterprises there are and the greater percentage of the business sector they comprise, a measure like this might not be a very good measure because they're not bringing in a ton of money, and they are paying out a lot of what they take in. So I wonder, this chart starts at a year when social enterprises were pretty much unheard of, at least in their current form. But I wonder what it's going to look like if they do become as popular as they are kind of among the faithful.
Nathan, you are an optimist, I have to say.
Yeah, I figured you would say that.
You have tried to put the best possible face on that one.
Well, yeah.
And not once have we mentioned the term corporate greed, but There you go. Okay. Sorry, that was my own editorial. These guys don't have anything to do with it. Um, okay, so there's actually a question that comes in to follow up on that one, on your answer, Nathan. Which was, do we know anything at all about the crowdfunding of benefit and B Corps? Is that included here? Is crowdfunding in general included in these numbers? What do what do you think about how much the crowdfunding phenomenon has been captured by this research?
Well, that's a really good question. I think of when I think of crowdfunding, I think of it as much bigger than benefit corporations or B Corps. It seems like that's a source of revenue that's fairly new, and that it could be coming into all sorts of destinations. I don't know. I'm trying. I guess taking the narrow question, which is I think the one that I know the most about. I'm not sure what the best estimate is right now of the amount of money that benefit corporations take in from crowdfunding as opposed to other sources. I know they have the freedom and latitude to bring in money from all kinds of sources, especially corporate investments. And I'm really not sure what to the extent to which crowdfunding, just a kind of flash group contributions from individuals, constitutes a large share of the amount that social enterprises bring in. But I think one question is how much does crowdfunding count as how much does crowdfunding constitute as a proportion of individual giving overall? And that may be one for Patrick. But
what about it, Patrick?
Yeah, so we don't have a great estimate of that because we don't track. We track and report total giving by sources and by uses, and not by the fundraising source. I have to say, when you look at social media and so on, obviously, online giving has gone from 0 in the not too distant past to about 10% of total giving by individuals now is the best estimate. That's not our estimate, but that's from Blackbaud, I believe. But I think the other piece is that the Kickstarter and some of these other things, GoFundMe, a lot of these are not to charities, and so they're not going to be captured in our circle or our catchment of philanthropy, which is formal giving to legal 501c3s. I think one last thing I'll say, and Keith may agree or disagree with this, but I think I was interviewed a few years ago about an opera that was trying to avoid foreclosure, and they had a challenge grant from a donor, and they had to raise X amount of dollars within so many weeks on Instagram. And I told the reporter at the time, well, that opera is going to go broke. And they were really surprised by my answer. And I said, I just found out about Instagram from my kids recently at that time. And your profile for fundraising for the opera is a lot older than me for the most part, my age and older. And so, they are going to go broke, and they did. And so, social media is great; it has its place, but you have to be more scientific about it than using Instagram as a fundraising device as the sole fundraising solution for an opera. It might work fine for the Cub Scouts or the Girl Scouts or something like that, reaching an audience that's more age-interested, age-appropriate, but it's not going to work for other groups as well.
I think it's interesting. This gets back to what Nathan was talking about, is that as we get a little bit more agnostic about what we give to, sector agnostic, people are giving to their local bookstores, they're giving to, whatever local institution that they feel needs help, they give to each other when people have crises. That is certainly in the category of charitable or public benefit giving, but it couldn't be captured by what this study does at this point.
Yeah.
It is interesting to consider how much bigger that pot would look were we to be able to capture some of this?
Yeah, I would just add that Giving USA has got the historical data to really be the backbone of what we can learn. Whoops, sorry, I was on mute. I just wanted to add to that real quickly. I think Giving USA has the data that can really put a backbone on what we know historically about what's been happening in the philanthropic sector. I think all these things that we've been talking about are fairly new, and we can go back to the mid '70s to see what's been happening over the course of history, and in terms of giving from these various sources. I think that once we gather more data on the influx of money from crowdfunding, from the amount spent from social enterprises, which doesn't necessarily go to charities, I think we can get a much better sense of just how many resources are coming in to support charitable activities. But I think we have the fundamental pieces in this report, and we always have. So.
Right.
Ruth, I guess I would just add that, we did a study a number of years ago looking at formal giving versus informal giving by households, and and I think that this is not to devalue informal giving, but basically what we found is if you count all types of informal giving, then almost everybody is a philanthropist, which is fabulous, right? But it's impossible to capture that in the aggregate because if you help your neighbor, how do you mow their yard? The little old lady next door, if you mow their yard, how do you monetize that? If you help, if you give some cash to somebody that's homeless, well, that's philanthropy in some ways, but that's never going to be captured or caught in the either on the donor side or the user side. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that that type of philanthropy exists, that it's important, that's a vibrant part of society, but it's not a part of Giving USA, and arguably should not be.
Yeah, I think, but I think it is an open question as we look at the kind of blurring of the sectors and some of these more organized ways of informal giving that that may change over time, but who knows? I did want to go on to ask a question about, is there any, considering the number of mega donors that are encompassed in these reports and the mega donations, can you talk about whether or not what those mega donors are giving is a higher proportion of the total pot? And then the other question that I would have is there any information dividing kind of the receipts between large and small organizations? So do we have any sense of how much charitable giving goes to large versus small organizations in the country? And maybe, Nathan, you could talk about this a little bit. I don't know. Keith?
Nathan, you want to start off?
Oh, shoot. Am I? Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. I know we were warned about this. I think that, well, just the question of funding from other or money, that resources that come in from various sources, I think is, yeah, I think we definitely want to. We definitely, I think, are going to learn more about that as time goes by. But I think just trying to figure out how this fits into the patterns that we're looking at in the report is kind of a challenge. And I think just the limits to the information that we have about just various things, I think is really kind of a constraint on what we can say. But
And I think on a lot of those mega gifts, and Patrick, you may want to just give us some numbers of what they are in a percentage of the report. But I think where you're seeing those big donors give, obviously, is they have a tendency to give because they're giving such big gifts. They're going to those large organizations, those large charitable organizations, and I think you can really narrow that down a lot within education, for instance, where they're giving, and also where they would be giving maybe to a foundation, for instance. So some of those dollars that they're giving, even if it's $100 million plus, we have to keep in mind that's not $100 million that's going out to nonprofits all of a sudden. It may be parked, in a charitable foundation that they would be using. But it is interesting as we're seeing those and starting to look, Patrick, I think, at just what it means for moving philanthropy overall.
Yeah, so this project, I'll just add a couple comments. The mega gifts I think are important, and for the charity that receives them, that's a really transformative moment, right? That's Harvard getting $400 million gift. That Harvard's already a great institution; it'll be even better, and that's the whole point of those kind of gifts. Most of the mega gifts, as Keith pointed out, are going to educational institutions. Some are going to culture institutions, and some are going to healthcare organizations. But the vast majority of the dollars, as Keith mentioned, actually go to family foundations, and so a relatively small number of gifts, but a large share of the dollars of the biggest gifts are going to family foundations, and then those are given. Those are grants that are given out over many years to come. I think the other piece of it is that higher ed has done very well in terms of the mega gifts historically, and part of this is, other than your parents, your college or university plays a huge role in both developing you as an individual, intellectually, emotionally, and from a networking perspective. And so a lot of these mega gifts are from grateful alumni back to an organization that they feel played a transformative role in their life. I guess one last factoid. So the mega gifts as a percentage of total giving is relatively small. So it's typically 1, 2, 3% at most. And so it's not something that is radically distorting total giving, but it does play an important role for the charities that are the beneficiaries of those gifts. Ruth, I think you're muted.
Oh my gosh. One of our participants asked if we're seeing a trend towards dollars up, donors down, and what the implications of that are for nonprofits. Like, what are the strategies that they should employ to try to build the numbers of donors and what they're getting from donors? And maybe this is something, Keith, that you want to take?
Sure, and I'm sure Nathan and Patrick may have some input. I think it's something that we're all looking at. It's really this donor retention piece. I think a big part of it is that nonprofits really have to look at their donors in more a relationship-based fundraising than transactional. And I think if we're not engaging donors, and this is across all sectors. I mean, higher net worth people may be looking at investment. Millennials want to be engaged. So if we're not engaging those donors in some way, they're going to move and they're going to take their money elsewhere. And so I think that one of the things that we're just trying to really talk to nonprofits about is it's not really the bit about just asking. It's really about just telling the story and letting people know the work that you're doing. And that can't just happen in a quarterly newsletter. And again, I think part of what we've got to do is get away from that transactional giving where, Nathan makes a gift, and then the next time he hears from the nonprofit is when they want another gift. And so we're hearing more and more donors talk about that. So, and you can't necessarily, depending on the size of your organization, maybe you can't do that with every donor you have, but you really need to be doing it with a percentage of them. So I'll stop there and let Nathan and Patrick jump in if they'd like.
Just to add to that briefly, I think what you see, what we have seen in the past from what little data we have about donor retention, is that across the sector as a whole, for the organizations where we have data, the amount that is taken in from new donors is almost always just a bit less than the amount that organizations lose from from donors that they don't retain. In other words, that's the importance of the job that they need to do in retaining donors, and that's an illustration of the importance of going back to donors and really sort of building this relationship, encouraging them to stay engaged and not just give a lump sum of money every now and then. I think that that is definitely one of the constraints on the sector as a whole, and one reason why, at least for individual contributions, it's hard for it to grow.
So, did you have something to add, Patrick?
Just really quickly, so one of the things from an economic perspective, it's a whole lot more efficient to keep a donor, keep them on your rolls, and keep them giving each year than to bring in net new donors. It'd be much more efficient for the organization. We do a study every other year for U.S. Trust Bank of America on philanthropy among high net worth households, and we ask, do you stop giving? Have you stopped giving to any charities, and if so, why? And the things that are the most likely reason to turn off a donor are the things that are so obvious and avoidable. It's what they say: they didn't acknowledge my gift, they shared my name with other nonprofit organizations, and so I got bombarded. There's a change in CEO. So there's some things that charities can do. The mission that I was giving to was fulfilled. There are a number of things that charities can do, but sometimes it's just a change in financial circumstances and personal circumstances. People get divorced, kids go to college, and it makes it just difficult for people to make those same gifts.
Thank you. I think I'm going to end it there. I think we're just about at our time. I want to thank all of you, Patrick and Nathan and Keith, for being here today and generously sharing all of this information. Again, I apologize for any roughness in our format. We'll get better at using this or get another platform as we go along. But thank you very, very much. This has been a wonderful session, and I think we got to most, if not all, of the questions. Those questions that we didn't get to today, we will take under consideration at Nonprofit Quarterly in terms of ferreting out the answers to them and doing articles on them in the near future. So thank you very much for coming, everybody, and again, thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth.